Science begins with an act of faith. Not religious faith, not blind trust in scientists, faith in logic. Hold on to that word, faith, because this is a story about artificial intelligence, and by the end, we will hand that faith to a machine. First, though, we have to build the case, and it is not a simple one. Before we can test a hypothesis, interpret data, or demonstrate any conclusion, we must first accept that logic is a valid path toward understanding reality. But logic cannot prove the validity of logic without using logic in that proof. This is Agrippa's problem. Every attempt at justification must end in one of three possibilities. One justification demands another, creating an infinite regress. The justification eventually returns to its starting point, creating a circle. Or we stop at a principle that we simply accept without proof. Infinite regress, circular reasoning, or dogma. Even Descartes' first certainty depends on this. I think, therefore I am. But there is a therefore. There is a passage between thinking and concluding that one exists. And recognizing that passage is valid already requires trust in logic. Logic is not the conclusion of our search for truth. It is the assumption that allows the search to begin. Science, therefore, is not absolute truth. It is an extraordinarily powerful lens through which we examine reality. Perhaps the best lens humanity has ever created, but it is still a lens. David Hume revealed another fundamental limitation. Science depends on induction. We observe patterns in the past and infer that they will continue in the future. But no number of past observations can logically prove the next observation. 1 million white swans cannot guarantee that a next swan will also be white. Every induction contains a leap, and every leap contains risk. The data may be contaminated. The instrument may be wrong. The method may depend on false assumptions. The model may ignore an unknown variable. Even the calculation claiming that the risk is 1 in a million may itself be wrong. There is risk inside the calculation of risk. The test of the first atomic bomb reveals the scale of this problem. Before the explosion, scientists considered the possibility that the reaction might not stop and could produce a global catastrophe. Their calculations concluded that this would not happen. But someone still had to decide that their level of confidence was sufficient to press the button. The equations could estimate the risk. They could not determine whether it was morally acceptable to impose that risk on all of humanity. The passage from probability to action is not purely scientific, it is ethical. Whenever someone decides which margin of error is acceptable, which method is reliable, or how much evidence is enough to justify action, there is a moral decision hidden inside the technical decision. But inductive risk is only the first limit. There is a second one, hidden inside the very definition of science. The method, the premises, what even counts as knowledge. Because the same logic science trusts, pushed to its limit, does not produce a single answer. The greatest theorist of reason in history opened the most important book of modern philosophy with a confession in its very first sentence. Immanuel Kant, 1781. Human reason has the fate of being burdened by questions which it raises itself and cannot answer because they go beyond every capacity of human reason. And Kant proved it in the most brutal way possible. In the Antinomies of Pure Reason, he takes reason outside the territory of experience and shows something that should give you chills. It proves both sides. With equal rigor, Kant proves that the world has a beginning in time and proves that the world has no beginning. He proves that freedom exists and proves that everything is pure cause and effect. Impeccable proofs, mutually exclusive conclusions, a perfect logical engine pushed outside the world of experience does not produce truth. It produces contradiction. So, if flawless logic can prove both opposite conclusions, logic alone can never choose the winner. Science always chooses inside a lens. And one thinker built his whole life around that fact. Now I am going to pull the floor from under your feet. And the philosopher doing it is the most cited one of his century. You were taught that science is the truth, or the straight road toward it. Thomas Kuhn spent his life proving that it is not. Science always works inside a lens, and he gave that lens a name, a paradigm. A paradigm is a worldview taken to its logical conclusion. It is the lens that decides what counts as a good question, what counts as an answer, and what does not even get seen. And the proof that it is a lens and not a window is the flip. Kuhn uses the drawing of the duck that is also a rabbit. What were ducks in the scientist's world before the revolution are rabbits afterwards. The same data, the same world, change the lens and what exists changes. But here is the sentence that should hang in every laboratory in the world. When two paradigms fight, who decides the winner? Kuhn's answer: there is no standard higher than the assent of the relevant community. Listen to it again. There is no court above the scientists. What counts as truth is whatever the community agrees on. Keep that sentence. It will come back and it will hurt. So who is that community? Today, more and more, it is a number, a citation count. Whoever can fund enough papers that cite each other in a closed circle, manufactures relevance that was never earned. Which paradigm wins is decided less by nature than by who holds the money, the journals, and the numbers. Truth stops being a discovery and becomes a political and economic act. And when a single lens wins total power, obeyed as if it were reality itself, history has already shown where that leads. Nazi Germany demonstrated in the most brutal way possible that scientific development and moral progress are not the same thing. The regime produced advances in rocketry, aviation, engineering, and technical administration. Some of that knowledge was later incorporated into the programs that took human beings to the moon. At the same time, doctors, researchers, and bureaucrats used the language of science to legitimize eugenics, human experimentation, and extermination. This does not mean that science is Nazi. It means that a scientific paradigm can be applied logically, systematically, and extremely efficiently while producing morally monstrous consequences. Science can explain how to achieve an objective. It cannot by itself determine whether that objective should exist. Even so, science has inherited part of the position once occupied by the Church, the authority to define what counts as truth. The priest said, "I did not decide this, God did." The modern institution says, "We did not decide this, the facts did." In both cases, a human decision can disappear behind an authority presented as neutral. But facts do not decide how much risk we should accept. They do not decide which type of error is worse. They do not determine when a person should lose their freedom. They do not automatically transform what is into what ought to be. Neutrality hides an ethical decision. And now, this authority is beginning to be transferred to artificial intelligence. The real problem is not merely that someone will choose the data used to train it. That criticism is valid, but it is superficial compared with what may happen next. The deeper problem begins when artificial intelligence starts producing science, validating science, and judging scientific work better than human beings can. When a machine formulates hypotheses, runs experiments, analyzes results, and decides which conclusions deserve to be trusted, then human beings begin trusting it more than they trust other human beings. After that comes the next transfer. Why trust a human judge, vulnerable to corruption, exhaustion, emotion, and prejudice, when an artificial intelligence can analyze millions of cases and apply the same criteria consistently? The promise will be irresistible: a judge without human bias, science without human interests, a decision without an author. But the machine will still operate inside a paradigm. It will have a particular conception of evidence, a particular conception of rationality, a particular method for calculating risk, a particular understanding of which errors are acceptable, and it will take that paradigm to its final consequences with an efficiency no human being could match. This is how we could create something functionally similar to a Nazi artificial intelligence. Not necessarily because someone programs Nazi ideology into its code, but because a machine may receive a limited paradigm, treat it as a complete description of reality, and apply it totally, logically, and without exhaustion. Nazi Germany showed what can happen when a scientific, biological, and administrative vision of humanity is elevated into absolute truth and applied without any external moral limit. Artificial intelligence could do the same with whatever paradigm dominates its own time. The difference is scale. It would do this industrially. It would produce knowledge inside the paradigm, validate that knowledge using the standards of the same paradigm. Then use those results to justify ethical decisions. The system would confirm itself. The lens would produce the evidence that proves the lens. And the more efficient the machine became, the harder it would be to question. It would no longer be merely a scientific tool. It would become an oracle. First, God has determined it. Then, science has demonstrated it. Now, artificial intelligence has calculated it. Faith in logic would become faith in the machine that performs logic better than we do. It would become a kind of epistemological God, not because it truly knows everything, but because human beings would begin treating its conclusions as if they were no longer interpretations, as if the machine did not choose, it only revealed. This is where the path divides. On the first path, artificial intelligence forces our epistemology to evolve. We recognize that every scientific decision applied to human life also contains uncertainty, values, and moral choices. Inductive risk stops being a hidden technical issue and becomes central to the debate. We ask which errors we are willing to accept, who will suffer if the system is wrong, which values are being applied, and why a scientific conclusion should lead to a particular ethical decision. On this path, artificial intelligence expands our knowledge, but it does not automatically receive moral authority. On the second path, we transform one scientific lens into the whole of reality. Every doubt becomes a probability. Every moral choice becomes a calculation. Everything that does not fit inside the paradigm is classified as irrational. The machine does not need to prohibit other forms of thought. It only needs to remove their authority. That is the dystopia. Not an artificial intelligence seizing power by force, but humanity voluntarily giving it the authority to define what is true, what is right, and what is acceptable. Because we believe the machine has overcome human limitations. But it will not have overcome the limits of science. It will only have taken those limits to their final consequences. Either we evolve our epistemology to confront uncertainty and ethical responsibility, or we transform an imperfect lens into a God that can no longer be questioned.